Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today, we are talking burnout. As I mentioned in the season overview episode, burnout, along with well being, is two of the topics that we're going to spend more time on this season than any other. And we're kicking it off today with burnout. So, just by way of introduction, burnout is a concept started with helping professions. It was a way of describing a response to chronic work related stress. So, not something that happened just one time, but something that was ongoing and chronic. So, something happening over weeks, months, years. And as I've said before, when I think about work, my definition of work is whatever you're called to do that day. So, that could be a job, it could be a gig, it could be a conference, it could be caring for family members, doing household chores, working in our communities. Whatever it is we feel called to get done in a day, that is the work. And so this is a stress related to that work. So for today, I really want to start with some burnout stats. I'm going to share a model of how you can think about burnout. And as I discuss that model, I'm going to share some concepts to consider for identifying, preventing, and stopping burnout based on research, my personal experience, and the experience of others that I know. So to start with, some interesting stats. So one is, and this came from McKinsey, who's a consulting firm, that employee stress levels have been soaring in recent years. More than half of American workers say they experienced burnout in 2023. And so McKinsey has termed this time the Great Exhaustion. So you may remember we had the Great Resignation kind of after COVID. And now some of us are experiencing the Great Exhaustion. Another stat is that women are more likely than men to suffer from burnout. I always wonder too, that could also be just more likely to report as well. But one study suggests that 46% of women said they were burned out compared with 37% of men. And then a high rate of burnout was reported in mid-level incomes, with 44% in the $30,000 to $60,000 range or bracket reporting burnout compared to 38% in the $100,000 and above. You could wonder, as you get to even higher levels, does that burnout increase or decrease? Probably depends on how that money is being acquired, essentially. But at least a certain level of resources and income might be a protection factor to the effects of work stress. And, that shows up in the literature in other ways as well, that there's a certain amount of money we need to be happy to meet our needs. After that, that money may not contribute to more happiness, but there's a certain amount that probably is needed to just offer a layer of protection from work-related stress. And then this last stat I thought was interesting is that the time it takes a person to recover from burnout can vary a lot, of course, between individuals. But one clinical study, which basically talked to different clinicians and got their perspective, suggested that from short-term burnout, so maybe you're working on a project, you have intense care for someone for a period of time, you might recover within a few months, 3, 4 months. However, in severe cases of burnout, recovery can take longer than a year, sometimes even up to 3 or 4 years. And I think that's interesting because it's not days and weeks, which is what I think a lot of us think. I remember when I was burned out thinking, I just need a day off. And I really did. And that probably would have helped, but it wasn't going to be enough to help me fully recover from burnout. Recovery is a long-term strategy that may include time off, but isn't just time off. It's an approach we have to take to integrate it into the work that we do, because most of us can't just take off for months because we're burned out. Some of us can, and if you can, I'm not against it. But, a lot of times long-term recovery from burnout is an approach, a way that you have to integrate into the work that you're doing. And just when we thought remote work was the answer, a couple of stats on that. 69% of remote employees reported increasing burnout from digital communication tools, video communications, just being in front of screens so often. 53% of virtual or work from home employees said that they worked more hours than when they were in the office. Now, there's probably some, give and take on that in terms of reduced commute and other things, but working more hours. So again, kind of more time in front of the screen, or doing the kind of work you're doing from home, or more time on the phone if you're doing customer service. And 48% of employees working from home said they lacked emotional support. And there are just some new surveys out talking about how people who work from home likely experience a higher degree of loneliness. So one study found that actually more men than women, but 39% of people working in remote locations from home struggled with loneliness, and 53% of men. So while we know working from home can boost job satisfaction, it can help with higher levels of well-being. It can also make people feel socially isolated. This came from a Microsoft study, and increased feelings of loneliness. So even when we're working from home, the risks of burnout are prevalent. So kind of my high level summary of these data points is that burnout is a significant problem in the US and in many places around the world. It's very complex, from my just reading through the research. It's like saying what causes stress. There are so many different potential causes, and those causes are going to be really different based on our circumstances and who we are as people. And I like to remind myself that many people aren't experiencing burnout. So there's something to learn from those of us who aren't in that place right now. It may not be personality, it might be circumstance, but nonetheless, there's something to learn from that. So along with understanding what's not working, I want to explore what is. So you'll hear a little bit of both in these episodes that we do on burnout. The other thing I've learned from the readings and just experience is that it's not typically a one and done thing. So many of us have life demands, personality characteristics, passions, trauma, lots of other things that can lead us into burnout. And I found that many people can go in and out of it at different phases of life. But the more aware you are of how you tend to get there and how you tend to get out, can affect the length and depth of the burnout. So a big part of managing it, stopping it, or recovering from it is self-awareness. So that's one question I want you to ask throughout this episode and all of our episodes. What does or what could lead me into burnout? What circumstances of my life, or what about who I am as a person? And what can I do about that on a consistent basis so that I'm either aware of it and can stop it early on, or once I get there, can recover quickly. So again, trying to lessen the length of burnout and the depth of burnout, right? How bad it really is. So the point of this episode is not an all-encompassing primer on burnout, because we'll explore that throughout this season. But I do want to share a model that I think is helpful in identifying and improving the experience of burnout at both a macro level. So let's say you're trying to solve it for a group, your family, a team, an organization. So some things to think about at the macro level and also at a micro level. So I'm just trying to solve it for myself. I'm trying to recover from burnout, stop it, or keep myself from getting there. So that's where we're going, and I'm glad you're here. Now available at Amazon. So let's start by defining burnout. So burnout, if you look at the World Health Organization definition, is a syndrome resulting from chronic work-related stress, as I mentioned, chronic, so over a period of time. And they say that has not been successfully managed. And I think that is a nod to both the organization around helping individuals manage it and our own self-strategies. So work-related stress that's not been managed. And it's characterized by three dimensions. One is a feeling of energy depletion or exhaustion. And, burnout is not the same thing as tired. Like we can all have, long days and be really tired, and tired can be good. Burnout is exhaustion over time. So exhaustion, energy depletion. Second is associated with increased mental distance from one's job. And so distance, you can think about it, as I mentioned, it started with helping professions. And I've heard some people in helping professions say this, that in order to manage the emotional stress that sometimes those jobs come with, the mental stress, even the physical stress, they kind of detach themselves from the person or the situation. Sometimes they say it can even feel like you're becoming a little callous, but it's kind of this need to distance yourself mentally from one's job. It can also come with feelings of negativity or cynicism related to the work. And third, it's characterized by reduced professional efficacy. You just don't feel as effective anymore. So you're exhausted, you're disconnected or cynical, negative about the work, and you just don't feel as effective as you once did. And one of the most popular models for understanding burnout is called the demand control support model. And this model was created by Karasek in the 1970s, and it just suggests that work-related stress is influenced by two things: the demands of the work environment and the control we have over that work. The higher the demands, the likelier the burnout. The less control we have over that work, the likelier the burnout. And also that social support from colleagues, managers, family can act as a buffer against the stress. So again, demand and control contribute to it, and support can be a buffer from it. So what I like about this model is that it differentiates the demands of life from the support that you receive. For example, some of us use coping mechanisms to cope with burnout, right? We might go on vacation, talk to a friend, spend time with family, and those things can really help, but they don't necessarily lessen the burden or the weight of the demand. They just make it easier to carry. And I think it's important to know when we're addressing one side or the other of the burnout equation. When you have the ability to address the demands, you can solve a problem so that it doesn't require the same level of support or doesn't require the same level of self-care to meet those demands or to carry it. I also like that the model addresses the level of control, because sometimes we have control and just aren't using it. And there are times when the control factors are very limited, right? We just don't have a lot of control to influence our work demands. So I think it's kind of a comprehensive way of looking at work stress and burnout. It's been a ton of research done on it since the 70s as well. And I initially was going to describe and to kind of discuss the entire model in this episode, but it's honestly just too much. You all would be tired of hearing me talk, and so would I. And there's just so much to explore at each step. I didn't want to cut a step short. So instead, today, I'm just going to focus on the demands element. And in another episode, we'll focus on the control and support elements because they're all really different. So for me, when I think about the demand aspect of the model, it starts with asking yourself a question. How high are the demands of your work? And again, work could be whatever you're called to in that day. How high are the demands of your work as it relates to your capacity to do that work? So at different times of our life, we have different capacities. So this isn't like an absolute value measurement of how many hours you're working or the scope of your role or work. This is your personal assessment of your ability to meet the demands of your work. So what you're assessing is if your work demands are higher than your current capacity, equal to your current capacity, or lower than your current capacity. And your capacity could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional. And don't think about it for today, right? We all have bad days, we all have good days. Think about it for the last 6 months or the last year. Based on the context of your life, would you say that the demands have been higher, equal, or lower than your capacity to meet it? And lower isn't always better, right? Because low demands could also mean boredom. I don't know if you've ever worked a boring job. I have, but I did data entry for a while, a short while, honestly. And for me, I just found it so boring. I was typing, which honestly I love to do, but I was typing in the names, addresses, phone numbers for, I don't even know what it was for, but we were putting it into the computer off of hard copies. I'm a great typist. The hours were fine. The environment was fine. People were fine. But the mental demand was so low that it was boring. And boring can feel like not being challenged. Boring for me was looking at the clock every 10 minutes. And that also can lead to burnout. So having demands that are far, far lower than your capacity may or may not be a good situation. Or there can be times when you have super high work demands, but you feel like you have a really high capacity to meet it. So it's not about how high or low the demands are. It's about your capacity to meet those demands. So either lower, equal, or higher. And for me, if I think about the last 5 months, the demands have been about equal. But I'd say the 6 months before that, the demands were higher than my capacity. And I felt the stress of that. And I'd gotten to a place of burnout, not severe burnout like I've been before, but definitely burnout. And I honestly feel like I'm just recovering from it now. So, the kind of thing about how long it takes. After a week or two, I felt better. I'd taken some time off over the holidays, but I feel like just in this last month, I'm recording this episode in May, is when I really started to feel like myself and recovered. So thinking about your work demands over the last 6 months or year, once you have an assessment, lower, equal, higher, Let's talk about what you can do about it and what you should be aware of. So if you're not in a burnout situation, you don't get there if you're not there right now. So before we jump into the strategies on how to manage it, let me just first acknowledge that sometimes there is not anything you can do. There are times when the demands of our work outstrip our capacity, and there's just not a lot we can do about it. Maybe we need the money right now. Maybe it's caretaking responsibilities that we just can't change. Maybe we're on a 6-month project that we've decided is worth it, or we can't, get out of it. But there are times when, you can't make a lot of changes, so you don't have a lot of control over your demands. But there are times when we can. We can change our experience with the demands of the work. And when we can, we should, if it's going to keep us out of burnout. So I want to talk about 5 strategies for doing what we can when we can. And I want to talk about really first how to reduce the demands that you might have. And then secondly, how to increase the capacity. Because either one of those can help in having demands that are more equal to your capacity. So the first strategy to reduce the demands from a work perspective is to prioritize your work responsibilities. Oftentimes, I'll say we, and I know me, decide that a whole list of things is important and we hold ourselves to that standard, but sometimes it's a self-imposed standard, and that can happen in our work or in our personal lives. At work, I often notice, and I thought about this a few times, that the years I thought I worked the most, gave the most hours, contributed the most, were not the years when I got the highest performance ratings or raises. Now part of that could be something wrong in the system, clear. But also, I think a lot of that was because a lot of the things I was working on were not things that were necessarily prioritized by the organization. I often took on other things that I thought were priorities for our team, for myself, things I just thought I should be involved in. And that is all well and good. Not saying don't do that, as long as it's not outstripping your capacity and leading you to burnout. So my first tip is to get super crystal clear on the most important priorities for you, your team, your organization, if you're leading a large group. It's amazing how many times we take on more than is required or even expected. And by the way, then get upset when it's not appreciated, right? So when the performance rating or the raise doesn't come after that year of overworking or overinvesting, then we're upset when we don't get the rewards for that work that maybe no one even asked us to do in the first place. So if you're in a place of having more demands than you have capacity for at work, my first tip is just to get really clear on the priorities of your organization, the priorities of your role, the priorities of your team, and make sure you're really focused on those and considering dropping, reducing the demands that are outside of that, because you may be outstripping your capacity by self-imposing some of those standards. And, the same thing about priorities can apply to our personal life as well. For example, I like a clean house. I like my clothes washed, dried and folded and put up when I can. I like my yard to look a certain way, etc. And it's really easy to create a long list of personal priorities. So one strategy I've heard is to decide which priority you're not going to be good at and just be okay with it. I'm not going to be good at folding clothes. Children, you might be clean, washed, and dried, but you're going to be a little wrinkled for a couple months because that kind of next step of folding immediately, hanging up, and God bless you parents who are ironing every day. I know some of you, I honor and celebrate you, but those that are doing that, that's great if you have the capacity. If you don't have the capacity, that may be something you say, okay, that's just not going to be a priority for this for the next few months, especially if it's summertime, really. I mean, that's definitely not going to be a priority for the next few months. And honestly, I'm sure most children would prefer to wear wrinkled clothes with a pleasant, present, non-burned out parent than they would to have no wrinkles, creases, and a parent that is burned out, frustrated, lacking patience. We have to get clear on what's really important in these priorities. And sometimes personally, we put the things to do ahead of the person we want to be, right? So we're putting the things to do, the clothes washing, the decorating the house, the yard, the whatever, ahead of how I really want to be able to show up for my family in a way that's pleasant and kind and intentional and full of energy. So we can accidentally put the energy into the thing that's actually not that important. So, that tip is to be clear on your personal priorities. And if your personal priorities are outstripping your capacity, choose one that you're just not going to be great at. That just is what it is for the next several months. The other strategy I've heard about is and this came from this podcast called Fried. It's all about burnout, but she talks about practice disappointing people at least once a day. And when I first heard it, I was thinking, wow, who wants to disappoint people? So I know that can sound a little crazy, but it's because sometimes we take on more demands than we need to. And we tell ourselves if we don't, they're going to be so disappointed. In reality, they may be, but they also may not even notice, right? So another way that we can manage the demands is to let other people own and manage their own responsibilities. So I'm not tell someone you're going to do something that you're not. You want to be impeccable with your word always, but I do mean stop taking on extra things that no one specifically asked you to do in the first place. And so I noticed myself doing this the other day. The other day I was riding with my husband, and I'm generally a very involved navigator, I would say. So if he's driving, I look up the directions on my phone of where we're going. I, keep them on my phone. And I'm basically giving him turn by turn directions as if there is no GPS. I'm giving him these turn by turn directions. And it probably started from when we first started navigating in new areas. We moved to a new area and we had those big map books. You don't remember those MapQuest books, probably. Well, if you're of a certain age, you remember those big map books. And I was the navigator. And when we went to GPS, I just kept that role basically. I'm basically being Google myself. Even though when I'm not in the car, of course, he's doing all this with Google Maps or whatever. But anyway, we're on this ride. And I just was like really relaxed that day. I wasn't thinking about it. And so I didn't pull up the directions on my phone. And we're riding. And he's like, hey, did you pull up the directions? I text you the address. So I put it in. Again, I'm not thinking about it. I put the directions on my phone. I just set the phone between us in the middle. I'm still riding, looking out the window. I'm super relaxed. And he's like, what's our next turn? And so I pick up the phone and I tell him the next turn. But somehow in doing this is when I realized, why are you doing this? Like, there is fully a GPS. Like, why are you taking on this responsibility? So I find that a lot of times out of maybe habit or needs to control or just over involvement, we're taking on more responsibility than we need to in our personal lives as well. And so that's a simple example. Another simple example I heard on this podcast I mentioned, Fried, is she's talking about how you're sitting on the couch. Someone goes to the pantry and it's like, I can't find the popcorn. And then, we pop up to go help them find the popcorn in the pantry. It's like, they don't need help finding the popcorn in the pantry. They can do that on their own by themselves. They're fully capable. But sometimes we're just over involved in these priorities. So, in summary, if the demands of your work, job work, personal work, whatever work, are outstripping your capacity, or honestly, if you just want more capacity or more margin in your life, more time, then clarify the real priorities and pay attention to self-imposed priorities in your work and personal life. Can you deprioritize something and just decide, I'm not going to be great at that, and not focus on that particular demand for a period of time and still get probably pretty similar results? As I mentioned, my years of greatest promotion, my greatest raises did not equate to the years where I worked, the most number of hours. I even remember working with someone, he was much more senior than me at the time. And we were talking about something and he told me he worked 50 hours a week. And I was like, what? I was working way more than that. But I noticed that he was good at holding other people accountable to their work, meaning I was going to do my work, he was going to do his work, but they were going to do theirs too. And if they didn't, either they probably weren't going to be on his team or they weren't going to be really comfortable on his team. So his team was just used to being highly accountable. And so that helped him manage his workload as well. And he was super effective. So think about the priorities that you have in your life. Think about the ones maybe you're self-imposing. Can you deprioritize something? Can you let other people take on their own accountability so you're not doing that? And in what ways can you stop overworking or just taking on the responsibilities of others that, one, they may have never even asked you to do, and two, they may be more effective at doing themselves. So that's kind of the first strategy. be clear, and manage our priorities, which contributes to our work demands. So my second strategy on managing work demands, again, work or personal demands of life, is to get really comfortable with silence. So I've had clients that say they're not comfortable with silence, and this is in the literature as well, especially for women in leadership roles. So when a volunteer is needed, let's think at work, at church, a community group, the PTA, room mom, some of us fill the void. So, it comes up, we really need someone to coordinate this year's giving campaign or to be room parent, and you don't feel called to do it. You feel guilted into doing it because you're not comfortable with the silence of no one stepping up. So instead of that question coming out, can we really need someone to coordinate the giving campaign? We say, I'll do it. Avoid that. That's what we're trying to avoid. That is the same as taking on additional responsibilities without a lot of value because it's not what you were called to do. And I think this helps with that popcorn in the cupboard example too. Every time someone shares a need doesn't mean it's your responsibility to fill it. Now, there may be times when it is, and, let your spiritual guide, your Holy Spirit lead you to do what you're called to do. We're called to be generous people and we're called to be wise people. So we don't want to necessarily just sign up for everything because there's a moment of awkwardness. Let the awkwardness pass. Think about it. If after that no one signs up and you go home or you think about it for a couple of days and you think, oh, I really think I should do that, then do it. But don't be called into it just because of a sense of guilt of other people not stepping up. So when we're called to and we feel like it's for us, let's step up. And I always say, if it's a responsibility I have, I want to be able to do that responsibility well. But when we're not called to do something, let's just be really comfortable with silence and the awkward moment and let that keep us out of responsibilities that really we weren't supposed to sign up for in the first place. I mean, think about it. How many times have you signed up for something, agreed to do something, and then when it comes time to actually do it, you are so bitter and resentful, or maybe I'm talking to myself. I'm so bitter, resentful. I'm thinking, why did I do this? I'd rather be doing X, Y, and Z. And it's like, because you signed up for it, right? That's what you signed up for. So now you're in it and now you have to commit to it because you've given your word. And I believe in being impeccable with our word, but I didn't have to sign up in the first place. And so for me, and I'm going to suggest for you, if you're not comfortable with silence, get comfortable with silence. And don't allow that silence to guilt you into doing something that you aren't called to do. My third strategy on managing demands is to put the Pareto principle into action. And this is one of my favorites. The Pareto principle, which some of you all are aware of, states that 80% of your results come from 20% of your effort. Or you could flip it and say 20% of the effort gets 80% of the results. And there are lots of examples of this 20-80 principle at work. It started with a scientist who noticed that 20% of his pea pods yielded 80% of the harvest. And since then, people have looked into how this principle shows up in so many other ways. So I'll just share a few internet examples of how this shows up. And if you were actually going to research the details of these examples, as I did for several of them, it may not be 20-80. Sometimes it's 10-90, meaning 10% of the work produces 90% of the results. Sometimes it's 30-70. But in general, the principle works. And I think even it makes common sense. So I want to share a few of these just to get you in the mindset of this Pareto principle. And then we'll talk about how you might apply it to the demands of life. So 20% of the people post 80% of the content on Instagram. 20% of the computer bugs produce 80% of the crashes in Windows and Microsoft. 20% of the people control 80% of the wealth. 20% of professional athletes contribute to 80% of the revenue. I thought this one was interesting. 20% of the people in a family cause 80% of the problems. I don't know if that's true, but I thought that was funny. 20% of the customers produce 80% of the revenue. 20% of the customers produce 80% of the complaints. That's probably also true for most businesses. 20% of your wardrobe is worn 80% of the time. Yes. 20% of the apps on your phone get 80% of the usage. Yes. And 20% of your work produces 80% of your results. So, if you want to operate by the Pareto principle or put this principle into action in your life, you have to identify the 20% of things in your life that if you do them really well, you focus on them, do them amazingly well, they will deliver the 80% of the results that you're looking for, or sometimes make that 80% not even as important. Right. So in my personal life right now, my 20% is helping the people God called me to help, meal planning for the family, and working out. That's kind of my 20%. And helping the people God called me to help includes kind of, my faith and spiritual principles as well. That's my personal 20%. So, what is the 20% in your personal life? What is the 20% in your work life? And how do you really nail those? How do you focus on those, do those super well so that then you get the 80% of the results? Or, the other part of the 80% isn't even as important. One way I think about it for my 20% is if I'm healthy, then, and I have meal plans, I'm working out, just taking good care of myself, I don't have migraines. And I also don't have migraines. I have much, much less, many, many less migraines. And I'm not spending all this time, caring for them in bed, trying to recover for them. And then also the time that I'm trying to recover is time I'm not doing work, right? So that 20% for me personally is super important because of the link it has to my personal health and wellness. So what is it for you? What is your 20%? And how can you use that to prioritize your work and your personal priorities and better manage the demands of your life? So, my fourth strategy is to question the beliefs that may keep your demands high. So, I know I've said things like, I can't sleep or I can't rest until my whole house is clean. Really? Is that true? Maybe it's true, or maybe it's something I'm just telling myself, which is keeping the demands high in my life. Some people have a belief that I have to hold my own. So that belief makes it hard to ask for help or to share challenges that they're having. There are also beliefs we tell ourselves about the organizations we work for. No one is getting resources added to their team right now. Really? No one? Like, question that. Again, it could be true, or it could be something we're telling ourselves to keep ourselves from having this very challenging conversation, right? I remember when I'd started a role that was, it involved a lot of vendor management and more external exposure than I'd had before. And I was getting these calls from vendors who wanted to meet with me as a member of the organization to learn more, sell, of course, but I didn't really realize all of this. So I was actually getting back to every vendor that called me. And of course, by the way, once you replied, now you're really on the list, right? So you're going to get lots of calls. This was years and years ago. I mean, the internet was a thing, but not a huge thing. And I remember telling my manager one day that there's all these vendors to connect with. And he was like, you don't need to respond to those calls, just delete them. Like, and I was just so happy. It was such a relief because I believed that it was my responsibility to contact these vendors as a representative of the organization. And it was putting on these pressure and demands on my life, and I didn't even have to do it. And we do the same things with returning text messages and phone calls. Some of us think we have to return a text message and phone call in an hour or two. And maybe that's a requirement in your role that could be. But personally, is that required? Yeah, we want to get back to people, but I have friends who respond to text messages in days, not hours. And I've been trying to be more like them. I'm not, but I'm trying. So really question the beliefs you have about what is required and ensure that those beliefs aren't putting so much demand on your life that they're outstripping your capacity or they're taking away the margin of your life. And by margin, I mean the extra time. I know I said that earlier. Margin is like the extra time you have to do whatever you're called to do in that moment. So make sure that you're not allowing these beliefs put extra demands on your life than what is called for. And, without being aware, leading you into burnout. I've had people say, I can't work without a clean office. Maybe that's true. And maybe that's just a belief that is allowing you to procrastinate from the things that are really important to you, right? So not only are you procrastinating, not getting done the work things, but you're spending time on something that's not even that important. So think about the beliefs you have that put demands on yourself and question yourself. Are those really important to me? Are those really priorities? Or can I approach it differently? And the last strategy for today is about increasing our capacity. So one way is getting help, right? Help at work, help at home. Both of those things can reduce the amount of demands on you, because it might be carried by a lot of people, or it might just increase your capacity to manage a larger group of demands. So, at work, do you need to request additional resources on your team? Permanent, temporary, contract? Do you need more resources, consultants? Do you need to get other teams involved in taking on their accountabilities? I've noticed at work that, the most accountable person teams tend to get the most work. My mom used to say, if you want something done, give it to a busy person, because they have a work ethic, they have a level of accountability that they're likely to get something done. They're busy for a reason, and that's not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if the work you've taken on has now outstripped your capacity or the capacity of your team, because over time, you're not even going to be effective in that work. So one way to reduce the likelihood that your capacity gets outstripped is to increase your capacity. It doesn't always have to be about reducing the demands. One of my mentors used to say that it didn't matter what kind of work they brought her, responsibilities, she could always take it on. She always said yes. And her yes came with the requirements or resources needed to deliver on that work or deliver on that project. So again, you don't always have to reduce demands. Sometimes you want to increase the capacity. And that's something sometimes we have to ask for. We have to be assertive in requesting. We have to influence other people for, so that we personally and the teams we lead, if we're a leader, have the capacity needed to deliver on the work that is ahead of us. And you can increase your capacity personally as well. So I mentioned that, my 20% right now is really about helping the people God's called me to help, meal planning for the family, because we're in different places in terms of dietary needs, and it's really important right now. Also, my personal health, working out, like those are my personal 20%. But there are times things come up that I really want to do. It's not on my 20%, but I really want to do it. And I do, as long as I have the capacity to do it, or I can find a way to increase my capacity. So the other day we hosted a meet and greet for a candidate in our local area, which is also a dear friend of ours. And when I took on that demand, my husband and I volunteered for it. We wanted to do it. But the timing of when we took it on, I also knew it was a very busy time at work, and I didn't really have the capacity to do it. But, and I really didn't want to do what I would normally do to get that done. Stay up all night cleaning, doing all the things that are required to make this happen late at night, super early in the morning, all over my weekends. So, one way to approach that is to increase your capacity. And by doing that, one way we did that was we asked some other friends of ours who are really good friends if they wanted to co-host it with us. And, they were like, yes, we'd love to. They were looking for a way to support him as well. And that really increased capacity because, one, now I had someone else to brainstorm with on the event. And I think I've told you all, I'm kind of better together. I really like collaborating. I think I'm at my best when working with someone else. So I had someone else to brainstorm on the event. We co-planned the event. We both invited people to the event. We both contributed food and other things. At the event, we both carried the social requirements of hosting and making sure people feel welcome and, doing all of those, opening the door, doing all of those kind of things as well. And it was just super fun. So it was a way of increasing capacity, and it was also a lot of fun. And the other thing I did was, again, it was a super busy time at work. I was traveling and other things. We have a friend of mine that helps clean our house, and she had just come the week before. She usually comes every 2 weeks. And I called her, was like, hey, can you come like the day before? She came. So again, that increased the capacity so that we could take on this demand that, we really wanted to take on. And by doing that, I was also able to really enjoy the event, spend time with my friends, feel like I was supporting the people I love, in his bid for a political office, which he won, by the way. And it was a lot of fun. So again, in thinking of demands, one thing you can do, and some of the strategies we talked about are about reducing those demands, decreasing those demands. But sometimes you don't want to reduce the demands, or you can't reduce the demands. So the other question to think about is, how can I increase my capacity to meet these demands? So I hope something in those 5 strategies is helpful to you. The first step in thinking about all of them is thinking through, what can I do? Is there something I can do to address the demands of my work, my job type work, my personal type work, all the work? And or what can I do to increase the capacity, my capacity, the capacity of my team, the capacity of my organization? I'm in that Gen X category, and I don't know, I'm just tired of overworking. One, I feel like I've seen the movie enough to know that it's not required all the time to live the life that I want to live. And I've also noticed that the rewards, may be tied to hard work, but they're not necessarily tied to overwork, at least not for chronic extended periods of time. I think that's kind of a fallacy we tell ourselves. And I'm just choosing to tell myself a new story. So, the next time we're talking burnout, we'll talk the other two aspects of the model, which are control and support. But I wanted to start today with talking about demands, reducing demands or increasing capacity. So, thank you all so much for joining this episode. I am excited about this topic for the season. I'm excited about well-being for the season. I think it's going to be, we have some great guests, some great conversations. So, drop me an email. Let me know what's going on with you in this burnout situation. How are you? How can you address the demands of life and or increase your capacity? And what are strategies you've used or have used before? We also still have some guest slots open. So if you're someone who is a specialist in burnout or well-being, or someone is, drop us a note. We'd love to know about them, and we'd love to invite them on the show, or we'd love to know about you and invite you on the show as well. If you're not in my email group, so that you can let me know these things, there are a couple places you can go. But if you're not in my email group, there's a link to join the crew in the show notes, or we'll put a QR code up on YouTube at the end of the episode. So you can also, scan that and join there. You can also go to my website, arlenepacegreen.com, and it has lots of ways to connect with us as well. And as always, you can find me on Instagram at Arlene_pace_green. So again, thank you all so much for joining. If no one has told you today, I love you. I am proud of you. You are killing the game. We're going to keep killing it, while not killing ourselves in the process, right? And that's a lot about what this season is about. So I love you all so much, and be well.